This is CC 2024M, a life-size Commando Droid commission that we built from over 23 pounds of filament in just over 60 days. This is my first commission, and in this video I'm going to walk you through the process from start to finish of how we brought him to life. All of my builds start here, on the commissions page. Whether you're looking for a droid, a prop, or something completely custom, this space is for you to bring your ideas to me, and together we're going to figure out how to make it happen. For this project, I sourced the STL files from Droid Division on Etsy. Dave's designs are excellent and ready for serious builds, which made them the perfect choice for this Commando Droid build. All the full-size droids you've seen me build on my channel have been Dave's designs, and each one of them is beautifully designed and creates a high-quality build. Once we get the downloaded files, it's time for us to prep for printing. I get asked very often about my slicer settings, and honestly, it's not super an exciting answer. I don't deviate that far from the standard, but what I do find works really well for my droids is to increase the wall loops. I usually find that 4 or 5 is good for structural durability, and then I also go with a low infill setting like 10% to keep it lightweight. These are small tweaks, but in the process of making a full-size droid, they actually make a big impact. For my very first full-size droid, I made the mistake of going really heavy on the infill setting, and his head was so heavy. So we don't do that anymore, and now we strengthen using wall settings. For support settings when needed, I like to use tree supports because I find them to be easiest to remove. The printing process was no small feat, and we had 2 bamboo X1 carbons running nearly non-stop for this operation. And for the most part, we really didn't have any failures or disruptions except for power outages during Hurricane Milton. To keep us organized and give Gilbert a front row seat to his droid build, I made a Google spreadsheet so he could see in real time the pieces and where they were at in the printing process. Everything is logged here, from printing to sanding to painting and assembly. This system allowed for Gilbert to be able to see his droid progress in real time, and he could see as we completed tasks. This was an easy tool to keep us on the same page and made the process feel a lot more collaborative. Once all the pieces are finished printing, it's time for us to get everything assembled together. Building a full-size droid on a small printer means they have to be cut into many pieces. Luckily, Droid Division designs the files so that they're compatible with smaller printers. You just have to get creative and learn new methods of how do you attach all the pieces. For this particular project, we decided to try PETG Gloop for the first time. Typically for my droids, I'd be using CA glue to attach the pieces instead of PETG Gloop, and then plastic welding using metal staples along the exterior. And this creates a beautifully secure hold. The downside of that method, though, is on the post-print processing side, I'm now having to remove the weld lines left from the metal staples. PETG Gloop was an intriguing alternative because it had the potential for us to reduce post-print processing time. What makes PETG Gloop different is it doesn't just glue the 2 pieces and adhere it actually chemically bonds them together. And according to the company's website, they actually say that it's a stronger bond than the filament bonds to itself. The biggest downside I've seen so far is that it is a little bit on the pricier side to pick up. Also, unlike using something like CA glue, it is not an instant bond. You need to make sure it cures fully, so that's giving it like a full 24 hours. And ideally, in a perfect world, we would have been able to clamp these pieces together, but the droid's shape does not allow for that. So we ended up having to actually hold the pieces together for an extended amount of time to make sure things actually bonded. The secret to this process was going really heavy on the glue, as well as sanding each of the mating surfaces before putting them together. With the glue, more is definitely better. And if you don't get enough, there's a chance that the surfaces won't actually fuse and adhere together. We learned this the hard way as we were trying to fuse together a tail for a full-size Velociraptor. Which, if you want to see that, make sure you are liking, subscribing, and following for project updates, because Jurassic Pond is one of our upcoming projects, and I can't wait to share it with you. I will say on this project, Alex was my rock. He was so helpful in helping me get everything done for this droid. After the PETG Gloop had finished curing and all the pieces were assembled, it was my turn to take our Liquitex modeling paste and move into the post-print processing part. This is where we're going to fill in any seam lines and remove the layer lines. Now, Liquitex modeling paste only comes in one color, and that's white. But when you're printing with white filament, it makes it super hard to see where you've already applied your modeling paste. So a nice life hack that I've come up with is adding in acrylic paint to my modeling paste to change the color and make it easier to see what have I covered on my droid and what hasn't been covered. There's a lot of great methods out there for cleaning up layer lines and seams, and I always love it when makers share their favorite workflow. I'm forever learning from you guys. In the past, I've tried wood filler, UV resin, Bondo, glazing Bondo, and glazing Bondo actually used to be my go-to for a very long time. With glazing Bondo, I absolutely love the finish I would get on my projects, and it worked great every time. The downside is there's some really intense warning labels on glazing Bondo, and it's one of those things you need to wear a respirator for, have gloves on, be in a well-ventilated space, and even still you're having to stare at those cancer-causing warning labels. So for me in my journey, I really wanted to prioritize finding a solution that was going to be non-toxic and that would still allow for wet sanding. because I did really like using wood filler, but the downside of wood filler was I wasn't able to wet sand, which is part of my workflow that I really enjoy. When I found Liquitex modeling paste, one of the allures for it was they said it dried stone hard and was still sandable. And with my experience of the product, it is 100% accurate. Liquitex modeling paste is also on the thicker side, so I will oftentimes thin it out using a little bit of water. Comparatively to Bondo, there is a longer dry time with Liquitex modeling paste, but for me, I don't really mind that for it being a non-toxic solution. I'm able to use this product in my home with no respirator, no face mask, and no gloves, and no problems. The other thing I love about Liquitex modeling paste is it comes in a gallon bucket. When I did the math and breakdown, the gallon bucket was way more fiscally affordable than going with glazing Bondo in the same quantity. In my post-print processing workflow, after the Liquitex modeling paste is dried, then I go in with my filler spray. For this one, I'm using the Seymour filler spray. This spray goes on and it gives a little bit of a thickness and fills in gaps, and it's also sandable to get beautiful smooth finishes. I've tried a lot of different brands of filler sprays, and one of my typical go-tos is the Rust-Oleum 2-in-1 sandable filler spray. But I've also tried Duplicolor as well as now Seymour, and honestly, I like all of them. The Rust-Oleum 2-in-1 is usually my go-to because I can usually find the best sales for it. But the other brands are lovely too, and when the sales pop up, I always am quick to buy them. For a project like this, I do use multiple cans of filler spray, especially for different cycles. Just to get the initial first coat on for this droid, I believe I went through 2 cans of the spray. So when we're doing large projects, I do buy in bulk because we have a lot to work through. The Rust-Oleum 2-in-1 out of all the different fillers I use is the only one I typically can find at a hardware store. The Duplicolor and Seymour and other filler sprays I've tried, I've not found in hardware stores, and I've exclusively purchased them off of Amazon. I do have an Amazon storefront, and I will add that in the description, so if you're interested in checking out what products I typically use on my droid projects, you can easily access them there. And of course, if you have any questions on any product I use, or things I've tried or haven't tried, always drop me a comment. And speaking of the Amazon storefront, my #1 favorite sanding tool right now is this mini sander. It attaches to our air compressor, and it has made our life so much easier when it comes to sanding the droids. We also have this file sander, which is really nifty for spaces too. And good old-fashioned hand sanding. Can't go wrong with that. In the first cycle of sanding, I typically will start with a low grit like 80 and work my way all the way up to 400. So for round 1 of the cycle, I will typically try to go from 80 all the way up to about 250. Maybe 400 if it's a really smooth piece. And ultimately, throughout each of the cycles, I'm trying to work up higher and higher on what grit I'm using. For this project, we didn't go higher than 600 grit. Sanding is the most time-consuming part of any of my droid builds, so I've invested a lot into finding tools that work for me. Because as much as I hate sanding, and I think it makes all of us a little bit crazy when we have to do it often, it is a huge part of what creates this magical experience of looking at something that was plastic and having it look real. Like an actual droid from Star Wars. I've gotten asked before on how many times do I repeat this cycle for each piece. And that cycle would be the Liquitex modeling paste, the filler spray, and then the sanding. And in my workflow, it really depends on the piece. Some pieces are initially more smooth than others, and some have larger weld lines or gaps, or bigger seams. So each piece gets as many cycles as is necessary to get the finish I'm looking for. And I do have a very high standard, so I really do want it to look as real as possible. After each cycle of sanding, I will take my pieces to the sink or use my garden hose and then rinse them off and let them sit out to dry. For this project, one of the first pieces that passed our smoothness test and got out of the post-print processing cycle early was the head and the feet. Alex spearheaded the charge on getting all those sanded and ready to go, so we were able to move on quickly to doing the base coat of our spray paint, which for us was a Rust-Oleum Gunmetal Gray. This won't be our final color for our droid, but it will be a really great starting point. We will do the top and bottom sides for all the pieces, but in between those coats, we do make sure it's fully dried before we flip it over. We're gonna let that Gunmetal Gray dry here. And then for some of the other accent pieces, we're gonna actually be using Rust-Oleum's Metallic Gold. These are the elbow joints and the knee joints that we're spraying right now. Same color I used on C-3PO. And now we're jumping back in the next cycle with some of our other pieces. So instead of going in with the Liquitex modeling paste, we're gonna go right into our filler spray. And this time we're using Seymour Red Iron Oxide Sandable Primer. So switching it up a little bit. As we go through the sanding process, when you see all these multiple layers start getting exposed, it actually looks really cool when they have multiple colors. We'll give that some time to dry, and we're gonna move on to taping off our foot. So just like the gold accent pieces on the shoulders and knees, these sections we're leaving exposed for the taping process are gonna be sprayed with the gold spray paint. To tape them off, I'm just using painter's tape, and any parts I don't cover with the painter's tape, I'm gonna end up using saran wrap. For this taping session, we're working on the knee joints, both left and right foot, and then also the hips. When I work on my droids, I usually block off several hours to get things done. And that's because each point in the process is time consuming. Luckily for you guys, I get to speed that up here to make it more fun to watch. The feet really weren't that bad to try to tape up and pretty easy process. I'm not really focusing at all on covering up the bottom of the feet because we're only spraying the surface of them. The hips, however, are going to be our more challenging thing to cover up. And it's going to require so much more detailing on the tape job because we're going to be going around a curved surface. So instead of using one long piece, I actually use a ton of little tiny broken up small pieces to create the circular shape. It can get confusing that we have so many different pieces in multiple different stages of the process and keeping track of what needs what when, which is why that spreadsheet really came in handy for this project. For some of my builds in the past, I'd wait for all the pieces to be in the same stage of the process before moving on to the next step. But this build, I have a much tighter timeline, so we need to keep working on pieces as they're ready instead of waiting for all of them to be done at once and then batch it from there. This actually ended up being the much more efficient way for us to work. And look at us, we're almost done with the taping job for the hips. Now we're going to move on to spraying it with our metallic gold. This isn't the only metallic gold paint that I've tried in the past, and for C-3PO I even experimented with the Montana brand of gold paint, but that one ended up coming out a little bit too rose gold for my taste. So I moved back to Rust-Oleum. I like that it's not a chrome finish, but it's a beautiful shade of gold. And we're not done spray painting yet. We're going to switch back to our gunmetal gray and work on some more pieces that have finished our post-print processing cycle. These little items were really quick for post-print processing because they were very small and easy to work with. Which on the flip side of that, we're back to sanding. We're doing the upper leg. This part of the post-print processing cycle took a little bit longer because I was really focusing on the seam line and making sure it was perfect where it looked like one unified piece and not something that had to have been attached at some point. There are a lot of dust particles that kicked up during the sanding process, and because we're using fillers, I always make sure to wear my respirator to prevent inhaling any of these particles. Now we're working on the Commando Droid's upper torso. And if you remember from our modeling paste section of this workflow, we actually had some really big seams and gaps that we had to fill. So we're going to end up focusing and doing a lot more rounds of sanding on this piece just to make sure it's perfect and gets that seamless finish we're going for. We have moved our way up in the world though, so we're starting with more of a 200 grit and working up from there on this session. And we're moving back to the other leg. When we're outside sanding for long extended periods of time, the vibrations from the tools after a while make it so your hand is tingling and feels really funny. Overall, I'm really happy with the progress we've made in this session. It's almost where we need it to be, where we can move on to the next stage of the process. And part of how I can feel that things are ready to move on to the painting stage is because of this hand sanding process. I like the hand sanding and especially wet sanding because I can really hands-on feel the smoothness of the surface to know where are we and is it up to standard. It also is great because I can feel any kind of tiny imperfections and address them quickly. The pieces we're currently working on is this piece is our forearm, which we're almost about ready. Oh, yep, that's feeling smooth and good. So we'll be able to move on with this one. And then our next piece we're working on is going to be the upper arm for the Commando Droid. Both of these pieces were initially split into two and we fused them together using the PETG Gloop. And now look at them, they look seamless and beautiful. And dare I say, I think these two will pass our test and move on to the next stage of the process. So after we're done with this sanding session, we're going to wash all of our pieces off and let those get dried before we move on to the spray painting part. When washing the pieces, I try to be really thorough and make sure we get all the gunk out of all the nooks and crannies. We'll set that to the side, let it dry, and now we're moving on to spray painting. Back again with our Rust-Oleum gunmetal gray and trying to evenly work our way around the droid. I always find this part of the process to be extremely rewarding because you get to see it for the first time with its beautiful coat of paint on as a seamless finished product. I've had people in the comments before come to me saying that they actually love how it looks after it's done with the post-print processing before I put the spray paint on it. And they've asked me to build a whole droid just keeping that look. And I don't disagree, it actually does look really cool. So who knows, maybe eventually we'll do that. But for now, we're going to do the oddly satisfying part of removing our tape. Removing the tape is always oddly satisfying, but at the same time, it can be a little bit nerve-wracking. Because as good of a job as you think you did, sometimes in the back of my mind, there's still that lingering thought of, is there going to be any paint bleed out that I'm going to need to correct or fix? It's always an adventure peeling it off and really seeing what was the truth, how good did we do. For the feet though, so far so good. Now for both the gold and for the gunmetal gray of the feet, neither of them is going to 100% stay this color. Once we have all the tape removed from both feet and our hips, we're going to move on to some airbrushing. But first, we're going to take a quick detour. One of the things that we did for Gilbert's Commando Droid to make him special is we actually custom 3D printed and designed his own nameplates, the CC2024M. And the CC stands for Commando Class, the 2024 for the year he was built, and the M signifies Hurricane Milton as a special event in his life that occurred during his creation. We're calling it his storm-born origins. So as you can see, we've already moved on. We're now in the airbrushing stage. And for this, we're working on one of our shoulder pieces. With all the reference photos I looked at, the Commando Droid wasn't purely gold on these accent pieces. In the cartoon, he actually had some darker yellows and bronzes mixed in too. So with our airbrushing process, we're going to try to replicate that to the best of my ability and give it its own little artistic flair. We're starting with going in with our dark yellow. The airbrush paint I'm using is by X Duvet, hopefully I'm saying that right, and we're doing the ochre yellow color. Again, this is another product that will be linked in my Amazon storefront, so if you're interested in any of the colors I use, you'll be able to find them there. The other thing I've been doing for my big builds is I actually publish them onto my website. So you'll find blog posts there that go through the details of the process in kind of a text format of behind the scenes, workflow, products, and helpful tips and tricks that I've learned. So if you haven't checked it out already, rgbree.com. I started content creating on TikTok when it came to making full-size droids, and I always have tried to share the behind-the-scenes process from start to finish. And that's because I really want to demystify the process and really encourage you that anyone could do this. All of these were skills that I had to learn and develop along the way, and I try to share and teach the stuff that works really well for me. So if you want to make your own, you can feel empowered to do so too. These builds are a lot of fun, and you don't need a giant printer to make giant things. We just gotta get good at covering up seams. I will say, as someone who started out on TikTok and has more recently joined the YouTube scene, especially with long form content, YouTube is its own different animal. And if you enjoy these projects and want to see more of them, I appreciate every time you guys engage, like, and subscribe, and follow along for more. There's so many other cool projects I have come up here in the pipeline that I'm excited to share with you. I also recently became eligible for YouTube memberships, so if you want access to exclusive content, behind the scenes, or just to support me as a creator, definitely go check that out in my description. While we're airbrushing this forearm, I opted not to remove the tape to make sure we don't get any of the ochre yellow on our gunmetal gray. For this piece, I'm really focusing on the outside edges and working away around the perimeter. I also try not to linger in any one area too long and go as even as I can on the passes. We don't want any running paint, and we want it to have a very nice clean finish. In addition to doing the outside perimeter, we're going to also pull out some midtones and drag our airbrush a couple times down the center to build up an interesting look. I'm going to akin this to kind of like sun bleaching or just age of the paint. So as we can see, the before and after, there's definitely more of a warm tone after we've airbrushed and has more dimension and interest. So now that we have a baseline style to work from, we're going to get started on the other side of the forearm, before and after. So just like before, we're going to use our ochre yellow and we're going to work our way around. This is sped up, so in reality, I am actually going a bit slower. And once we made our way all the way around the perimeter, we're going to go up and down and make some of these subtle lines. Here my biggest focus is blending the colors to try to get a very smooth gradient with some pops of color, all while being very subtle. So that one looks pretty good. Both forearms are done. Now for the upper arms, we don't have as much to do. There's only this small part that connects to the shoulder that has our gold color. So same as before, we're going to use the ochre yellow and work our way around the piece. For these circular areas, I'm going to leave the center with the original gold and do the darker yellow on the outside. Same with the bevels and contours. I like to use a darker color to really accentuate the shape and geometry. Now we're going to try to be very careful as we work around the foot, because unlike with the other pieces, I did remove the tape off of the foot because I wanted to see how it came out. So I'm going to have to be very mindful not to get anything on the gunmetal gray, but luckily that's not too hard. So here we're shading the underside of the circular part of the droid's ankle, and once again we're going to go around and contour the piece with the yellow. We're going to do the same thing with the round oval shapes on the upper arms. So skirt the perimeter and then subtle lines and shading going up and down the droid arm, getting a beautiful and blended look. Now we're going to go back in and bump up the contrast using this bronze paint. This is going to definitely darken things up and make it stand out a lot more. So the bronze, we're focusing on areas like grooves and around the hole where the hardware is going to go in. This is going to age the piece and really make it interesting to look at. Oftentimes when you're painting up close, you can feel like, oh my gosh, this is way too much. I don't know, is this good? But when you assemble everything together, it makes a beautiful final piece. So don't be afraid to go in with a contrast and go have fun with it. We're working our way back around the droid knees and adding in our bronze paint. During the painting process, I often wonder what's actually getting painted more, the droid or me? And honestly, we may never know the answer. Hopefully the droid. Now we're going to use our dark bronze around our oval. Here we're just going to build off of what we already put down for the dark yellow and just accentuate it more to really increase the contrast and continue to improve the interest. So we'll do that on both sides and make sure the joints have a little bit more oomph to add it into. We're going to use up the rest of the bronze that we have here in the airbrush and finish up the foot. So same as before, moving it around, contouring, making it look all pretty. And now we're going to actually move into the next part, which is going to be our silver paint mixed with our dark purple paint to create the purple undertones that the Commando Droid has. When I first started this build and looked up the paint job, I initially thought that the Commando Droid was just gray. But the more research I did and the more reference photos I found, it became very clear that these purple undertones are actually a big part of his paint job. And when put together with the full look, make him quite stunning. To get this look right, we need to dance a fine line of having it be purple but also metallic. And to do this, I actually mixed two different paints. One was a metallic silver paint with a dark purple paint that's non-metallic. At this point in the early stages of the process, I'm running the airbrush over the grooves and concave areas to try to build up some interest in the look. I'm going heavier on the color on the outside edges of each of the shapes, and then going back through on the inside area to subtly blend things out. For this first piece, I'm definitely going to take a conservative approach and not go super heavy with the purple, just to make sure we like the look of it in the grand scheme of things. Because we can always add more on, it's harder to take off. So we're just going to keep working our way around. And as I said before, in case you're curious, these are the two different paints I'm using for this. Now we're going to work on the knee joint and the areas that aren't gold, and then move on to the hips. So same as before, outside edges, and then we're going to work our way and blend it to the inside. This might be a weird parallel to draw, but it kind of reminds me of when I do my eyeshadow. I'll use my darkest eyeshadow in the very corner by the eyeliner, and then I'll blend it out from there to make a nice soft look. So airbrushing is really not that much different. Let's get all the tape off of our forearms, and then we're going to do the same on here too. Okay, now that we finally removed all that tape, we're going to go in with the purple. To make sure we don't get any of the purple on our already painted gold areas, I'm going to use this piece of paper to block the paint flow. And now that we're done with that tricky area, we're just going to proceed like normal, carefully working our way around. Oh, looks like I missed a little spot of tape. For all these pieces, we're going to try to make it as even as possible with how much purple we're adding in. And I fully intend on coming back to each piece and doing a little bit more later if needed. Something I learned from working on my Commando Droid versus this commission is I wanted to add more attention to the inner parts of the forearm and the inner parts of the upper arm. As when you pose the droid in really cool positions, like was it the sword or a knife or have his arms above his head, the inner arms actually ended up being way more exposed than I originally expected. So this is an area that we're going to be mindful of as we go into the weathering, the detail, and the painting process to make sure it also looks beautiful. When this droid does finally arrive to Gilbert's home, we want him to be able to pose it however he wants and have every angle be its best angle. So at every stage of this paint job, we're going to do our best to make sure that that's the way it goes. No bad angles. The purple on this forearm is looking really good, so we're going to now move on to doing the purple on the hips. If you've been paying attention, you'll remember that this is our second pass with the purple on the hips. Since our first pass, it has had plenty of time to dry, and now we're going back in to blend things out even more and darken it up. And it's looking really good. Now we're going to bring our purple to the upper arms. Working our way with the darker colors again on the outside perimeter and blending out the center parts. We talked about having the inner arms be a little more interesting. As you can see on the upper right hand side, I did make a spot that was a little bit darker on the purple. We're going to go back in with the weathering later and keep accentuating to make that really stand out and look beautiful. Now for one of the biggest parts we're going to airbrush is the upper leg. This piece is quite thick. And we're again going to try to work to make it as even as possible. Going on our outside edges, focusing on all the contours, while also still making sure to get some along the center of the droid so it has the overall shade of purple. Then we're going to work on the shins. The shins are fun because they have all these really defined lines that we can run the airbrush up and down. By really hugging these edges with our purple, it's going to really pop and stand out. As I finish one piece, I try to move on to the next piece to give that first piece a chance to dry before going back and cycling through. We're going to do that with the thigh piece too and flip it over so we can get the inside too. Now the inside of the droid isn't going to be as visible or noticeable, but we still want to make sure that it's high quality everywhere we're touching with paint. One of my weirdly favorite pieces of this build is the stomach piece. There's so many fun shapes here that airbrushing and painting it and even weathering is so much fun. The way the piece catches the light is super fun, and it lends itself to a lot of creativity. Especially when you're painting really large scale pieces, it's good to break the pieces down into their smaller shapes. So notice what are rectangles, what are circles, what are lines, and try to treat them accordingly instead of focusing on, oh my gosh, how do I make this giant thing beautiful? What are the little small pieces of this giant thing that make the shapes and contours and edges and creates that beautiful overall picture when put together? We're going to work on the chest of the Commando Droid, which is another one of those high profile areas. I consider pieces like the face and the chest to be some of the most important pieces of the project because these are visual focal points that the eye is naturally drawn to. So making sure that our painting is really up to snuff here is really important to me. Here on these creases, I'm actually going a lot heavier on the purple. And part of that is I've just gotten a lot braver as we've progressed, and now I'm feeling really confident in how the purples interact with their base color. So the process has become a lot easier. Got a good workflow down, and the color is coming out really beautifully. Now we're going to move on to our head. Same thing again, we're going to follow all the natural shapes here. The circles of the eyes, edges of the droid. We're going to outline the skull cap, and then go from a farther distance to gently blend the paint with the gunmetal gray base coat. We're going to wrap up the back of the head, getting the last bit of detailing in, and then let's take a look at all the painted pieces together. We've gone from our gunmetal gray to this beautiful sci-fi undertones purple gray paint job, and honestly I couldn't love it more. Here are a few close-ups on how these pieces came out. Such a pretty droid. And with that, we're almost done with the airbrushing process, but we still have some more fingers and small pieces to go. When I tell you that I've been mixing paints together, I'm using that ochre yellow, and here I'm adding in the bronze as well, directly into my airbrush. Then I'm going to mix these colors up really good, tap that lid, and now we're ready to get back into airbrushing the hands. So this part I'm working on right now, this is the wrist joint, getting that all ready to go. This is the middle part of the finger. The fingers are in two different joint sections. This will be attached to the palm of the hands, or the base of the hand, and this one's the thumb. Get all that paint nicely in these creases. And another thumb. And then the little joint areas of the fingers. More connector joints. And for this project, I'm making extra fingers for Gilbert, so he'll have more fingers than he actually needs. This is in case he ever is trying to pose him and over tightens accidentally the finger joints. I want to make sure that there's extras in case anything breaks, since these are some of the smallest pieces on this droid. So it could be most fragile. Alright, let's remove all that tape really quickly, and back to airbrushing the purple. For the ratios for the paints as I mix, I'm really just eyeballing it. You can see the before and after of how these pieces look. Let's keep going with the other hand, getting all these layers nicely built up. And now we'll work on all the fingers. I'm using my thumb to actually shield the gold so we don't get any purple on that, and as a result, I am painting myself this time a lot. We're also going to use some acrylic paints on our custom nameplate for CC 2024M. And I'm going to just start using some dark black paint. There we go, set that aside. And once that dries, we're actually going to go in and paint over that black paint using the paint inside the airbrush so it has that same purple base color, really making it cohesive. The 3D model for the Commando Droid doesn't come with a button, so we custom designed one at Gilbert's request to fit inside his Commando Droid. And here we are airbrushing it. Now we're going to use some super glue and glue on our custom designed nameplate. Beautiful. And this is in Trade Federation font. We had a very lively debate on whether to use Galactic Basic or Trade Federation. Trade Federation won the day. The tally marks in the inner forearm for Gilbert's droid are one of the true customized pieces he requested. The story behind this is the droid is going to etch these marks into his own arm after each battle. These are going to represent kills. Gilbert was inspired by Gregor's helmet and wanted to do something similar for his droid, thinking through that he'd become quite sentient. These are all the tools I'm going to use to weather the droid as well as make the tally marks. The liquid chrome paint I'm using is my Molotov liquid chrome. This is one of the best I have found. I buy it off of Amazon, and this little bottle has lasted me a couple years now. So to make the tally marks, I'm actually going to use a spare droid finger to make it feel more authentic, as if the droid is already carving it into himself. When it came to the discussion of how much weathering Gilbert wanted on his droid, he didn't want to have it look like it was right fresh off the lot, but also on the flip side that it hadn't seen a ton of damage. So somewhere in between, where it's seen some battles and bears the scars, but is more lightly weathered than some of the ones I've done in the past. As to the question of how many tally marks should this droid have, I decided that 5 sets of 5 looked absolutely perfectly balanced on his forearm. We chose the forearm because when we talked about where the most likely place was that he would scratch these marks on himself, that's what we decided would make the most sense, having it be the forearm. With all the tally marks completed, it's time to move on to our detailed weathering. And for this process, I'm going to use my smallest paintbrush that I have, that actually is meant for painting designs on nails. So it has an incredibly fine and precise tip. We're going to be going through in any place that there's any divots from sanding or modeling paste or any kind of imperfections already pre-built into the mesh that are just barely visible and ever so minuscule. Instead of hiding them or pretending they don't exist, we're going to accentuate them and have them be the start of scratches and weathering for us. This is a really fun trick that brings your piece to life and uses divots and tiny little marks that already exist and celebrating them as part of the droid's history that creates intrigue and depth to the character. We might have made this droid 99% smooth, but that 1% that's not smooth, we're going to really work it. This method of using the tiny paintbrush is all about creating clusters of weathering. One of the weird things about me is I actually enjoy looking at pictures of rusted metal, tractors, cars, or vehicles that have chips and paint scratches. These I use as reference images and help me understand where would the natural weathering occur on pieces, so I could try to mimic it as best I can on my work. Alex will laugh at me because we'll be going to the gas station and I'll see like a rusted out trash can or car or light switch because we live by the ocean and salt rusts everything out. And I'll be like, oh my god, babe, look at that rust. It is so beautiful. Just because I think that the natural wear and tear on things has a certain elegance to it, and I really enjoy looking at it. Entropy in action, as they say. To go with the lore of him carving tally marks into himself, I made sure that the tips of the fingers on the right hand showed wear and tear from where the paint would have chipped off of his pointer finger to create the tally marks on his forearm. One of my favorite and most peculiar tools I use in my weathering process is an old wooden chopstick. So this is just like what you get at a takeout restaurant. What I'll do is I'll dip the wooden chopstick into a little bit of paint and then run it on the edges. This creates a beautiful weathering look and looks really organic and natural. I've been using this trick for years for my droids, and I always love how it comes out. Unlike the approach of using my smallest paintbrush possible, this technique actually allows me to cover a bigger surface area quicker while having it still be a really stunning result. Both of these techniques are really effective, and when paired together, they create a really beautiful result. One of the tools I find super helpful when doing this fine detail work are these magnifying glasses. They allow me to see up in super close HD detail. So while I'm working to make these tiny clusters and really bring the piece to life, they help me not to strain my eyes, while still giving me all the good visibility and helping me get those clusters I'm looking to make. And you might wonder, why am I taking the time to do all this? These are such minuscule details. Is anyone really going to notice when they see the whole big picture? No, they might not. but they will know how it all looks together, and they will see that beautiful blended cohesive piece, and it will make them have a feeling or sense of this actual droid having a history, a past, or a life. So whereas every scratch and dent may not mean as much to them as it does to me, it's still part of that whole bigger picture. And honestly, I think that's what makes us artists, right? When we can fall in love with the details, knowing that nobody but you will ever really truly appreciate every dot and scratch and mark, but it's still part of what makes this journey so worthwhile. The section of weathering on the stomach is one of my favorite pieces of weathering for this droid. I had the best time working on it. And the reference photo I used for this was actually from like a toy. I don't know if they even sell it or make it anymore, but it had such a lovely and very subtle weathering pattern that I decided to model the weathering patterns on this droid based off of it. It was so intricate and beautiful, and I think it translated overall very well into this. To make it more fun to watch, I have sped everything up so you could really appreciate how all these tiny little dots and details come together to make a cohesive, beautiful finished look. And once again, I'm mixing it up between using my tiniest paintbrush as well as the chopstick for the outer edges. And here's the final weathering look for the stomach piece, and it's definitely my favorite part. Next, we're going to move on to the chest, which is again our big focal point. So just like with the other pieces, I'm going to look for any areas in the mesh that have any natural weathering already occurring, and we're going to accentuate it using our silver paint. For this droid, we decided to go with this really cool crack pattern that has almost a spider web-like effect. Before I move on in the painting process for visual focal points, usually I end up having to take a break to psych myself up. Even though I've been doing this for years, there's always that little nagging voice in the back of my head that's like, what if you mess it up? This is going to be a big deal. This is a really important part. So it's good to just take a break, take a deep breath, and then jump back in. And as soon as I'm actually into the project, then I get lost in the details and start enjoying it and get in that flow state. But sometimes starting is just the hardest part. The weathering for this Commando Droid, it was 2 full days of work. All focused detail work, really making sure that I put my best foot forward for this droid and give a gorgeous finish that I could be proud of. The first day of the 2-day weathering process was all about the airbrushing, which we already have gone through. And then day 2 was from sunup till sundown working just with exclusively the silver chrome paint. By far, this is the prettiest weathering job I've done to date. And I know he is going to be so very loved in his new home. We'll keep working our way around the Commando Droid's body, getting all these details perfectly added in. I'm going to take my magnifying glasses off to give my eyes a little bit of a break before jumping back in with them. The unfortunate part of them is they are very heavy, so it does weigh on my nose. But it's worth it to be able to see the zoomed in HD version of this. Okay, we're done with the body and now able to move on to the head. Another visual focal point. So once again, like before, I took a break, had a little mini panic attack, worried I was going to mess it up, and then jumped right in. As far as reference images I found, I didn't find any really incredible ones for the back, so a lot of this is just going to be us winging it and making it up based on what the contours and what the piece kind of is lending itself to naturally. As we move to the front of the Commando Droid, I'll be alternating between having the skull cap on and the skull cap off. I want to make sure both pieces look like they match together perfectly, and that any weathering I include on them matches really nicely together. We're going to wrap up using our small paintbrush and move into using our chopstick again, just for the final edges and details. And then we're going to call this droid done. At least done as far as the weathering process goes. Our next step is going to be to take him out in the garage and do a clear coat to keep everything locked in for longevity of this project. Then I'm going to take him back in the house and we're going to do his final photo shoot. At the end of all my full-size builds, I always like to commemorate the project with the final photo shoot, especially for Gilbert's droid, because this is the first droid I've made that's not staying with me, so I'm not going to get a look at this gorgeous guy every day. So I really got to make these photos count. And the other nice thing of having these photos on hand is I can use this as reference photos for my next droid builds. This also is good in the instance that there are any shipping issues or any damages to the pieces from the mail carrier service during transport. So if I have to redo any pieces, I have a really good log of what did the piece look like before it was damaged and how do I replicate it and create a replacement that's suitable. Gilbert's personalized webpage for the commission shows start to finish all the process, has all the documentation, behind the scenes photos, and final photo shoot photos. All in all, working on this droid commission was an incredible experience, and he became my favorite Commando droid I've made to date. I'm always down for new adventures and new droid projects, and this one was such a fun one to bring to life. Thank you guys for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, definitely check out my others, and make sure you're liking and subscribing so you don't miss any new updates or notifications, especially as we move into new projects like Jurassic Pond, which I'm so excited about.